Hey, Micah, welcome to the OneLink podcast.
I'm glad to be here, James.
Yeah, you're getting to be here often enough that you're almost becoming a regular guest now.
I know that's why I told you I was concerned that people might get Micah fatigue.
Fatigue. Yeah, I was thinking we were like one step closer to getting you on staff. That's what I was thinking. If we could just slowly, slowly up the frequency. Next thing we know, it'd be like, well, we have this other meeting we'd like you to come to, and next thing you know, you could be working for us.
I guess it's a lot easier to get tricked into working remotely for somebody than working for somebody.
That's true. That's true. Well, I am really glad you came on today. Wanted to kind of talk through some more about this campus evangelism method that you guys use at New Mexico State. We talked with your dad. Um, I'm not sure if we're going to put this on before or after Matt Holland, who also uses a similar method, but he does a lot with tracks, which is what he'll talk about or talked about, depending on when we release this. I wanted to walk through this with you just in terms of like, how do you go about training somebody to do this? In some ways, maybe a more practical, hands-on deal. Um, I know one time when I got to go down to Fort Worth, you and I went over to a campus to share just so I could see how you did it. And so you told me some things along the way that you're like, oh, I always tell them this and this. And I thought, man, it'd be good to record that and have that out there. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can see, um, they can see what you're talking about. And then let's jump in.
Hmm.
All righty. So we're looking at Evangelism, Sweat-Free Witnessing, the study series. Jump in here. How do you begin training a guy? Practical, hands-on.
Well, I think initially it begins with the mentality of the trainer, which this isn't even on the page here. It's kind of backed up even before this step of believing that it's worth your time to train a guy or ladies to train a gal um, one-on-one repeatedly in evangelism, the same way that we might meet with somebody for one-on-one discipleship. And what I've found is that evangelism training is not really separate from discipleship training holistically. Ultimately, if you're growing in discipleship, you should be growing in living a lifestyle of a witness.
Hmm.
But oftentimes we don't do that in our discipleship meetings. We meet up at a church or at a coffee shop or in our homes and we talk about things, but we're not necessarily doing what the disciples had the benefit of doing with Jesus, which is to actually go on the go, learning from the mentor in evangelism. And so for me, when I disciple people, I really try to work in some evangelism outings in my discipleship meetings best I can. But I also love to take a guy and just say, I'm just gonna focus. It's almost kind of I'm gonna take this out of the discipleship competencies and give it its own special attention, weekly attention, because I believe it's that important and because I believe it's that under addressed.
Mm-hmm.
I want to meet with you and specifically just show you how to master a given evangelism presentation. Because if you can master that, then you'll be far more ready to share in any given scenario than if you're just somewhat familiar with a bunch of evangelism presentations. I want to get you really good at one.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's worth the time to give it its own weekly meeting where we
Okay.
go out and actually share. This, of course, is great on a college campus. I mean, it just lends itself to this form of training because where else are you going to find a bunch of people who are in a public space and are in a season of life where they're open to new ideas, they're very open-minded, open to conversation, and they also happen to just be sitting around waiting for like 30% of the day during the week. So it's pretty easy to go find somebody who's just sitting there waiting. What are you doing? I'm waiting. Well,
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit easier to start conversations that way. But I think uh, it helps and it carries forward into non-campus scenarios. At least it has for me over
Mm-hmm.
the last uh, 10, 12 years. even off the campus, this kind of training has been really helpful.
Okay.
But usually if I approach a guy, that's what I'm gonna tell him. Go ahead, James.
Okay. So can I just ask this? So if you're discipling a guy, are you scheduling essentially 2 weeks, 2 meetings a week with him then? Or yeah, is that how that works? Like I have one where
No,
we're talking about maybe what you're studying in the Bible, some other things, and then another separate one where you're taking him out and doing evangelism. How does that look practically?
I haven't done that before. What I did start working in with towards the end of my time on staff at the OU BCM was to just make every other discipleship meeting an evangelism
Interesting.
outing,
Mm,
and to be okay with cutting in half the amount of content that I could
mm,
work on with the guy in
hmm.
favor of on the go.
Practical
Uh,
training.
and I just found that to be like a sacrifice that I was willing to make
Hmm.
after having seen like, man, I'm not really actually showing my guys how to live on purpose and live on mission,
Hmm.
uh, because it's hard to schedule another meeting. It
Yeah.
just ends up being hard to do that. But normally, when I'm actually training a guy week after week, it's a separate thing. Like my hope is that he is also being discipled by somebody in the context of a ministry, or it may be that I want to. This is like my soft entrance to discipleship. There's a
Mm,
couple of guys that I've begun by presenting to them the idea of doing evangelism training.
hmm.
And then after a semester or a year, then it turned into full-fledged discipleship once they were trained in
Mm,
the evangelism presentation, because we had kind of been in the trenches together. And so
hmm.
they were even more likely to, maybe they wouldn't have been open to discipleship at the beginning, but they were open to evangelism training because that was a felt need or a felt deficit.
Mm,
Once we had been in the trenches together, I just had more credibility with them, more trust. We trusted each other. And so it pretty naturally turned into a full-fledged holistic discipleship relationship. But yeah, normally it's like a separate thing for me. Not saying that you couldn't do 2 meetings a week with your guy.
okay. Hold on 1 second. Hey, sorry about that. Um, what I'm going to need to do in just a minute, Micah, is run get the hot water heater draining and take like a 5 minute break or something like that. Um,
Yeah,
so if it's
no,
okay, we'll keep we'll keep plugging along and then we'll unplug for just a second if that works. All right.
yeah, that sounds great. I can't remember what I said last.
I know that's the problem when we do something like that
I think I can start off by going ahead and launching into.
into this. Yeah, you had just said, yeah, you had just talked about that was the reason why you saw the benefit of starting with discipling, sometimes even getting to sorry, with evangelism training, getting you to discipling.
Yeah. But ultimately, I think if we're gonna really like, especially with this particular presentation that I like to train guys in, it's gonna require weekly repetition.
Mm,
That the closest that you can get to it.
mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's why I really try to make it its own separate thing. And it won't last as long, as a discipleship relationship probably will. But making it its own separate thing, I find is worth it, because then you're also going to recruit them on the basis that they're going to turn around and train somebody else, so that you can multiply yourself in it,
Mm-hmm.
especially then. I got a guy right now that I'm training here at Texas Baptist College, and I've told him, I want to train you in this presentation, and it's on the understanding that you'll turn around and train somebody else. And so our goal for the spring semester is that we'll get him finished up and ready enough to pick somebody else up, one of his peers or a freshman, and start taking them out weekly. And that'll free me up to start taking somebody else out.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
That's
but usually when
excellent.
I start, yeah, I mean, it's the same principles as discipleship. It's just kind of like extracting the evangelism portion and
Mm-hmm.
giving it special attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe as we go through it, we can understand or flesh out more. Is it usually pretty well like a year-long process, a semester process? How long does it typically take someone to feel like, for you to feel
Yeah.
like they're trained, for them to feel like they're trained?
What I have found is that there's no typical.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
actually, um, I had one guy, probably the average is like a semester and a half. If I was going to give an average of the average evangelism training relationships. But I had a guy who I was able to train in 4 weeks,
Mm,
because he memorized the stuff really quickly. He was ready to start doing portions of it on his own right away. He worked on it throughout the week, and he was just pretty outgoing and conversationally confident already by the time I got him. So
mm-hmm.
after 4 weeks, I was like, man, I think you're ready to go ahead and train somebody, and you'll learn it even better as you train them.
Mm-hmm.
There's another guy that I trained that it took a lot longer. Um, he was really sharp. He could memorize the presentation very quickly, but when he came to me, his biggest deficit was the social
Mm,
side of things. So I felt like we got through trained the presentation really early and spent a year working on how to not be awkward
mm,
in some ways. And that's a lot of what evangelism training does too, is teaching people how to just interact with others well. And I felt
mm-hmm.
like it took a year for us to get him to where I felt kind of ready that maybe he could train somebody else. That the whole, all told, it turned out to like a year and a half long training.
Okay. Very interesting. So where do you go? You get a guy, he comes to you, you come to him, however that goes. How do you start?
Yeah, usually I'll just present, hey, I would love to. Um, sometimes it starts by, do you want to just go with me to share the gospel?
Mm,
As kind of a, before I pitch the whole committed weekly thing.
mm-hmm.
But once we get to the place where I'm ready to invite them to commit to a weekly training, then our first meeting, we don't actually go out on campus and share. I'll bring them in and I'll use this sweat-free witnessing guide that's in front of us here on the screen,
Mm,
because it kind of just, it really deals with some assumptions that people have, that may make them hesitant to do this kind of evangelism. I think the what is often called cold turkey evangelism, and my dad may have spoken about
mm-hmm.
this term on this podcast. It's not really true, but it's got a stigma, an unfair stigma
Mm-hmm.
today in the 21st century, that it doesn't work, or it's offensive, or it's more detrimental, or it's dishonorable, or something like that. And that's, these scriptures and these principles, I think, help introduce the idea that that's not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's reinforced by the outings and them getting to see it for themselves. So, you know, things like questioning your pride. Am I too proud? Am I too concerned with not being embarrassed to share the
Mm-hmm.
gospel with people?
Mm-hmm.
That exceeds my burden for the lost to know Christ, then that could be a reason why I'm not sharing the gospel regularly right now.
Mm-hmm.
Or the idea that no one I meet, nobody I meet is interested in the gospel. And certainly nobody that I meet randomly
Yeah.
on a campus will be interested in the gospel. And you got to get them to it. You got to at least get the person to the point, the guy or the gal, to the point where they're willing to try it so that then they can see for themselves that that's not true at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's just
Mm-hmm.
not true. Experientially, it's not true, but also biblically, it's not true. God is drawing people to Christ. He
Mm-hmm.
gets there before us, and that's why it's not actually cold turkey evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
And just understanding that that's a lie that Satan wants to use.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's interested. That person is interested. You shouldn't talk to that person. They're not interested. You shouldn't talk, even in relational settings, your uncle's not interested in the gospel. Your coworker's not interested in the gospel, that sort of thing. And it's it's also really helpful if you want to scroll down just a little bit on this document, James. Yeah, just to get the second half of the page. Um, to use the permission basis. I know that's already been covered on the podcast some too. And
Mm-hmm.
that has a lot to do with believing that God is the primary agent of people coming to faith and of gospel conversations happening, that he is going before us. We can never get to somebody where God hadn't gotten there first. And that means we have the freedom to ask somebody point blank, essentially, not in these words, but would you like to have a conversation about knowing the God who created you and having eternity with him? And if they say no, then we don't try to argue with them. We trust that God is working a timing for them that maybe we're not a part of. And
Yeah.
if they say yes, then we recognize that God got there before us, and it wasn't because of the winsomeness of our question asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excellent.
Ultimately, though the temptation might be to believe that nobody will actually say yes if you direct in asking them permission to share the gospel with them. That's also not true. Just experientially, it may be that it's more true in certain settings and contexts and environments than in others, but it's not true altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Um, even
Yeah,
overseas,
because
outside of the United States.
yeah, because that's what I was gonna say. Like, I feel like depends on where you're coming from, what your viewpoint is. But a lot of people would say that a college campus would be like the worst place, the place with the most liberal views, the people that are most against God. Um, what percent of people would you say when you ask them are like, yeah, yeah, I'd have a conversation.
Yeah. Well, that's actually something I ask my guys during this first meeting. I
Mm,
tell them what we're going to do. I say, we are going to go up to people that are sitting by themselves on a college campus, and it's going to be same gender. And we're going to say this, hey, we're on campus today and we're talking to people about a relationship with Jesus. Would you mind if we ask you a few questions? And then I'll ask the guy during this first meeting and I'll say, how many people do you think will say yes to that? And some of them will be really honest and say, nobody say yes to that. and some of them will, give a percentage, maybe 30%, 50%. And this is just anecdotal, but my experience has been across 3 or 4 campuses over the last 14 years that the average is between 70 and 80% of people say, have a seat.
yeah, yeah, that's excellent.
And the ones who say no don't say, no, you, and shake their fist at you. They're very apologetic. They're very polite and cordial. Sorry, I'm about to get picked up to go somewhere, or my bus is here, or I've really got to study for this exam. I'm sorry. It's maybe 0.1% of people that have ever shown any tone of hostility in their voice when they've declined.
Yeah, excellent. So what do
Yeah,
you, so after you help them work through that, and I'm assuming that some of that, like they intellectually can work through it with you, but they actually have to go experience it a while before it really sinks in.
yeah, yeah. Mostly with this exercise, the first meeting, I'm just trying to get them to where they'll be willing to come with me the first time and not like back out last minute,
Uh,
or
mm,
be tempted to present some objections
Uh,
about
uh-huh.
that that feel justified by some sort of misconstrued theology or something like that end up being lies. That's what
Mm,
John 8:44 here on this page is talking about, that Satan is the father of lies.
mm,
Right? When he lies, he speaks his own language, and that's I think we're all operating, all of us, with lies that are from the enemy that are trying to keep us from sharing the gospel.
yeah, I agree.
They're well constructed, sensible seeming lies.
Hmm. Yeah, I I agree, and it's easy to buy them. And sometimes we don't do our. Sometimes as Christian community, sometimes we reinforce those lies instead of combat them. So,
Yeah, yeah. Now, I will say too, and I usually explain this to my guy in this meeting as well. Um, the point of these outings is not to reach the campus with the gospel. They're like, what? And I'll tell them this is a bad strategy for reaching the campus. That's largely because we have no relationship with the person before we approach them and have the conversation, and we have no guarantee of a relationship with them afterwards. It's all contingent on whether or not they actually text back.
mm, hmm,
We'll meet up after we have that conversation with them. So it's not a good strategy for reaching the campus, but it is a good strategy for getting good at reaching the
the
campus
campus. Yeah.
and getting good at reaching the world
Hmm.
with the gospel. And so I'll tell them this is uh, it's hard to say it because it doesn't seem right, but this is more about you than it is about the people we're sharing with.
Hmm.
Now, praise God, people still come to faith in
Hmm.
these first time encounters and conversations. And I think God uses those in his sovereignty to encourage us in these outings. And oftentimes, I mean, he uses it to bring somebody from death to life.
Mm,
But I've had uh, not very great follow up
mm,
opportunities with people who I've seen come to faith in these outings, but that doesn't dissuade me from doing it because it's not my strategy for reaching people. It's my strategy for getting people ready
maybe
to
to
reach
reach
people and
people.
even for keeping myself sharp
Mm,
and burdened for the lost. So those are some of the byproducts that you see
hmm.
from doing this weekly evangelism is you get better at it. Ecclesiastes 10:10 here on the paper says in the Living Bible, a dull axe requires great strength. Be wise and sharpen the blade.
Mm,
So you're developing the skill of being able to share the gospel well and interact with people well in a winsome way. Um, it also results in our exposure to the lost growing.
mm,
It's like I'm
right.
at least being exposed not just to the lost as in like they're in that car over there that cut me off, but
Hmm.
I'm being exposed to the lost and seeing how like close they could be to
Hmm.
trusting Christ if they could just see the truth of the Bible, if they could just see the truth of what Jesus has done for us and be invited to receive him into their life. They're that far away
Mm,
from passing from death to life. And that kind of exposure increases your burden to seize the opportunities throughout your week in between the meetings
mm,
to speak up
hmm.
and engage people in conversation.
Yeah.
Um, and I saw that consistently with any of the guys that I would train. Sometimes I've heard the objections like, well, if we do this, if we have a scheduled time, then people don't share in other times. It's like they check the box. And
Yeah.
I
That's
just have
just
not
not
seen that
true.
to be true. I've not seen anybody who's yeah, I've not seen anybody who's willing to go every single week and share the gospel intentionally, discipline that then doesn't grow in the regularity of their evangelism throughout
Hmm.
the week
Hmm.
in the non-scheduled times.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a byproduct. And again, it's another one of those enemies lies.
Yeah. I agree. So where do you go from here? So you go through this Bible study and just to show people, there is a blank one. I'm assuming this is what you walk through them with and let them fill out their own. their own copy, or do you just
That would be the well, just to tell the truth, no. That would be the purest New Mexico State way to do it, and I think I've just maybe skipped a step a little bit to go ahead and get through it and get ready to start sharing.
Okay, gotcha.
But it's definitely a way to do it. You can do the fill in the blank.
Okay.
Sorry, New Mexico State.
There you go.
Yeah, this is a
Well,
little bit. This is the Micah
version.
filtered
Yeah,
of the New Mexico of what I have received from New Mexico State's training, which is I've received so much.
yeah. Well, what I see is that everyone has filtered it slightly. Like Matt does his slightly different than you do it. Maybe I'll have to go back and see if I can go out on campus with your dad to really get the truest form of this presentation. But all things said, like it's different tools. I want people to be aware that those tools are there, and they can go to the New Mexico State Christian Challenge website, which I will put in the show notes, and they can download all these things. And so if you want to go through it, fill in the blank, walking through it with them, which is probably at least how I would start. But you've done it this method longer and trained it longer, so I won't criticize you for that. That's how other people may adopt it as it goes. So once you go through this with the guy, you do that the first meeting. Where do you go from there?
At that point, I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, at this time next week, we're going to go out and actually share. And I want to go ahead and let them off the hook and tell them, no matter how confident I perceive that they are or not confident,
Hmm.
hey, I'm going to go ahead and just model it for you next
Yeah.
week. You don't
Yeah.
have to say a word. And if you feel uncomfortable not saying anything, you're welcome to jump in. But I want to
Hmm.
give you the opportunity to see this presentation in action, and you can be an observer.
Hmm.
And then little by little, as we keep going week after week, I'm going to hand off more and
Parts to
more
you. Yeah.
parts of the presentation to you until we will get to the point where I seem like the observer.
Hmm.
And I'm not really saying anything. You're leading out completely. And once we get close to that section, we're getting close to turning you off leash
Hmm.
so that you can train someone else. But I think that really takes a lot of it gives people relief is what I have observed
Yeah.
that the first meeting really there's nothing expected of them essentially except to
Yeah.
show up
Yeah.
and if I get myself in an uncomfortable situation so that they'll only have vicarious discomfort if any
Uh-huh.
discomfort.
Yeah. I agree.
um,
And I think that's so important. And to give an example, I've got the listener doesn't know this, but I've had to interrupt Micah a couple of times because we've got plumbers over at our house and some plumbing issues. And it started last night. And I had looked at it before that, but I just didn't want to tackle it because it was like I don't know what all was behind there. But when the plumber was there and they had issues, yeah, I'm happy now. Now, once I know someone's great is there with me, I'm happy to jump in and help and learn and try suggestions. And because I know more or less what I feel like is like, well, if I really mess something up, the person that can fix it is here. And so um, I feel like that's the same way when we do this. If you can say, hey, this time, all you have to do is come with me.
right.
Let me model it. And it does take a lot of pressure off. And, something your dad said the first time I was visiting with him about this, he was just saying most people have never ever actually seen someone else share the gospel, and that's huge.
Right. And that's just speaking to discipleship in general. I think the
Mm-hmm.
piece that's lacking from our general discipleship approaches largely is modeling.
Mm-hmm.
Again, partially because we confine our discipleship meetings to meetings
Mm-hmm.
where we pull away from the do aspect of walking with Jesus to talk about doing. And so the
Mm-hmm.
person that we're investing and mentoring doesn't get to see it in action.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been personally really benefited by getting to see somebody do something that I was pretty unconfident in
Mm-hmm.
various settings. And that has just shown me like, man, modeling goes along
A
and
long
Jesus
ways.
totally did that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So where do we go from here? You go out the first time.
Yeah.
Here's the three question approach. How
And
do you begin training this guy?
Yeah, in the first meeting too, we're actually going to walk step by step through this approach,
Okay.
especially focusing on the beginning of it, because that's the part that I'm going to be passing off to them sooner than later. And I'll tell them we're going to go up, and we're not going to say we're with BSU Christian Challenge because I'm not there anymore. But usually I'll just say we are going to approach somebody. We're going to go out on campus in pairs, and it's me and another guy. We're going to look for a guy who's sitting by himself, not because it never works to talk to a group or a pair or anything like that, but just because it usually turns into a better conversation
Hmm.
if you talk to someone who's sitting by themselves, because they're able to give you real answers without getting interrupted by somebody else giving their real answers. And you want to tailor what you're saying to the person. It's harder to tailor it to two people
Hmm.
in a sense. So we're looking for one guy who's sitting alone again on a college campus. That's usually not too hard to find somebody.
And where do you typically go? Because you've been at multiple college campuses. If someone's listening and they've never done this with somebody, and sometimes you just got to jump out and try.
Yeah.
Where do you go find these people? Where would
Yeah.
you typically look?
If there's like a student center on campus, that's a pretty safe bet. If the weather's nice, then you can tend to find people outside sprinkled all over the campus,
Mm.
especially near the student center and other areas of that get a lot of traffic. But this is where I also like getting to know the campus. I have had the benefit of doing this on two campuses where I was very connected with campus. One, I was a student at New Mexico State, so I knew the campus, knew where the people are. And at OU, I was on campus all the time. So I learned the campus. I knew where the people are. There was basically two or three spots where
Yeah.
we'd end up, and we'd look along the way and then end up at this destination where we knew a lot of people were. That's what we did at New Mexico State. And then whenever I moved here to Fort Worth, I actually got a tour of TCU
Okay.
from the Baptist student director within the first couple months that I was here. I just wanted to meet with him and get to know him, and he showed me all around the campus, and so I kind of got my bearings on that campus
Mm. Hmm.
before I ever went out and did some uh, campus evangelism there,
Hmm.
and that enabled me to not be a complete, like, if you come onto a campus and you look like you're lost, it can make
Yeah.
you feel less confident.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you somewhat know what you're doing and where you're going, it's one less barrier
Yeah.
to. So ask somebody who knows the campus for a tour
Give you
or
a
to tell you
tour.
where the people are.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay.
And then just generally, I'll tell them we're going to go up and we're going to approach them, and I'll tell them this. And I learned this from the guy that I trained who was needed to be trained in the social aspect more.
Hmm.
Like, I need to actually break it down, deconstruct it all the way to showing him how to approach people, because one of the guys I trained, once I finally turned it over to him to do the approach himself, he would walk all the way up to the person who was sitting there. And if they looked up at him, he would pause and kind of like turn around, like, oh, I'm not, what? And then they would put their head back down again, and keep getting closer. And we'd get all the way up to the table that they were sitting on, and he would be standing right next to him, kind of knocking his fist on the table, like nervously, kind of,
Uh-huh.
until they finally looked up at him, and it was, I mean, imagine kind of like a Don Knotts sort of
Yeah.
situation. You're going to have to coach them. And so I'll tell them, we're going to approach them just as though we were walking up to ask them, hey, could you tell me where the bathroom is? Like, just imagine that exact same approach. It's just
Hmm.
that instead of saying that, you're going to say, hey, we're going around to people talking about a relationship with Jesus. Would you mind if we ask you a few questions? Now, the tendency on this approach, whenever I actually turn it over to them, is to say, hey, we're going around, asking people some questions about Jesus. Would it be okay if we talked to you? And that's a subtle difference that you probably didn't even notice, but they flip. Instead of saying, we're talking to people, can we ask you some questions? For whatever reason, the tendency is to ask the question by saying, can we talk to you? And I may call me a stickler, but I try to tell my guys, no, like, let's not do that. Don't ask if you can talk to them, because I think that too many people have a concept in their mind of evangelists. And what they hear when you say, can we talk to you, is, can we talk at you?
Mm.
And there's just something more, there's something that feels a little bit less unsettling to be asked, can we ask you some questions?
Yeah.
Can we talk to you? Because nobody wants to be preached at.
Yeah.
Another reason why I love this presentation is because there is really no monologuing at all. Within this presentation. It's based on asking good questions with follow-up questions, and then using scriptures, letting the scripture do the monologuing of sorts. And so that can even leave people with a good taste in their mouth after you've talked with them. And they're thinking, wow, nobody's ever approached me like that before. Usually they come talk to me and then they want to rattle things off. And, if we were doing chess and you did the timer of how long the moves took, their move took 8 minutes before I got to say something again. And in this presentation, that's not what we're doing. And I don't want it to seem like that's what we're doing on the front end.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so they say, you walk up, can I ask you a few questions? They say yes. Then what?
Well, first I'll say, if they say no, and I'm training the guy, we're going to say, that's fine. That's fine. And I hope you have a great day. And if we have some tracts on us, Matt will be talking about his tracts. But if we have a tract on us, this is where I'll take the opportunity to say, but is it okay if I just leave you with this? Because who knows if maybe they will read it in Christ, even though I don't get to be a part of it. But we're going to let them off the hook right away, which is comforting to the sharer and to the person being approached, that there is no pressure at all. Again, because we trust God that he's already prepared who he wants us to talk to that day. And maybe the reason they said no is so that we'd get to the person down the line who will say yes, that God really wanted us to talk to.
Yeah.
But if they say yes, then I just say, you mind if we sit down? And here's a nuance too. Again, this is just kind of, this is part of the New Mexico State training. Don't sit surrounding them. There's 2 of you and 1 of them. Don't sit on the other side of them, because then they're feeling like they got to do
back and forth.
Yeah. Or it totally takes the other person out that's not talking as much out of the picture, because they're just looking this way the whole time. So I try to tell them we're going to sit on the same side of that person if we can help it, so they don't feel surrounded.
Okay.
That also helps if they end up having somebody come and join them later. They have somewhere to sit, that they can sit next to their friend,
yeah,
their boyfriend, whatever.
Yeah. Excellent.
And then another thing that I make sure to tell them is, we're going to try to establish rapport when we first sit down. And that's really easy when you're a student on that campus, because the campus. You can, hey, where are you from? What are you studying? Oh, you're studying this. Are you taking this professor? Oh, I have a friend who's in that class. You're just trying to establish common ground, which establishes rapport and hopefully helps to show you're just like them, or as close to just like them as they could imagine. And it doesn't take long to do that, a minute or 2.
Yeah.
Then I'll tell the person I'm training, and then you got to just go right for the first diagnostic question that's listed here. Go ahead and transition, whether it's a smooth transition or not, where you just say, you've been talking about something completely different, like how your football team just won. And then you take a pause and you go, well, so-and-so, because you've gotten their name at this point. I recommend that, James, have you ever given very much thought to spiritual things? The reason why this is a needed segue and a natural segue is because of the way that you approached them. There was no bait and switch. They know exactly what you're sitting down for. And so actually it's weirder if you never get to the spiritual conversation at this point. Because you told them, we want to sit and talk with you about a relationship with Jesus. So if you just kept talking on and on and on for 3, 5, 10, 15 minutes without actually getting the spiritual things, it's kind of like, all right, guys, what are we doing here? Does not catch them off guard if you just ask them, have you given much thought to spiritual things? And that immediately changes the tone of the conversation, and they're ready to talk spiritual with you because they already said yes.
Yeah. And there's 3 different diagnostic questions hear, do you ask some of all of them? Just pick one, whatever you feel like's best for the person you're sitting with? Do you have a default you like to go to?
I try to ask all three if at all possible.
Okay.
And this
Okay.
includes non-scheduled interactions
Actions.
with people.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this, you can imagine this, have you given much thought to
Thought.
spiritual things question is pretty usable
Mm-hmm.
if you're in a conversation with anybody anywhere. If again, you can just ask it without it even having a build up,
Mm-hmm.
almost as though I'm trying to be friendly. What's the next topic that I could ask you about? Well, have you ever given much thought to spiritual things? Another way to ask it could be, did you grow up in church or in any kind of religious organization?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Listen to what they say. And during the diagnostics, our goal is not to really do a whole lot of responding.
Just
It's just hearing,
mm,
letting them talk, and then ask the next question. The reason I really like to ask the next question is because it takes the nebulous spiritual things
mm,
down to a pointed question.
mm-hmm.
Have you ever been right with? There's some other presentations that have said, will ask, you ever come to a point in your life? Well, this is on the third question. Sorry. I'll ask them that question about relationship with God. Most people will answer it. Even people who told me at the beginning of the conversation they're an atheist
Mm,
will answer it, which is another thing that I tell my guys in the approach. Don't say no for anybody. If you go up and say, can we ask you a few questions? And they say, well, I'm an atheist. Tell them, well, that's okay. We'd love to hear what you have to say too. Or
mm-hmm.
if they say, well, I'm a Christian, we'll say, that's okay. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Um, just
Mm-hmm.
because somebody says they are something doesn't necessarily mean that they are, or that they would be um, opposed to hearing what we have to say.
Mm-hmm.
And this is shown by how they answer these questions anyway. The person who says they're an atheist says, yeah, I think I have come to be right with God. You're like, and I think that's how most atheists are, actually.
Yeah.
And then the person who says they're a Christian and they answer this question with, that's tough. I guess not. I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
Uh-huh.
Again, tells you what their understanding of
Uh-huh.
uh, salvation
Yeah. And at this
is.
point in time, you're not trying to like correct whatever their views they are. You're just listening like, oh, well, thanks for, okay, interesting. Very, very
Right.
nice. What about, and you're just asking another question. What about
Yeah.
if somebody, what about someone, let's say you sit down with someone, they're Native American and they're like, like, or they're Buddhist, they're an international student and they don't believe there's a God or they don't believe in God the way we do. Still ask the same
Yeah.
question.
I prepare when I'm training a guy, I still am preparing him to just keep plowing right through the presentation almost no matter what, because again, people will keep answering your questions more often than not. I would say
Mm,
it's like less than 3% of my conversations between New Mexico, Texas, and Oklahoma. So I know it might be different depending on where you are geographically. And on the other, in other countries that don't have a Christian basis, I'm sure it's completely different. I
mm,
haven't done this presentation like in China or India or Russia or
mhm,
Indonesia or anything like that.
mhm,
But here, even with the more New Age religions or Eastern religions that are represented, less than 3% actually would say, like, well, I don't believe that there is one God, like, kind of derail the
mhm.
question process. So plan for the 97%,
Yeah.
assume the 97%. And then even if they say, well, I don't really believe in God, I can't answer that question. Then
Mhm,
I'm going to move on to the third question. Instead of saying, if God was to ask you today, you stood before him today and he asked you, what makes you right with James, what makes you right with me? I'll ask it just by saying, well, what do you think it is that makes a person right with God? Or what do you think it is that uh, most people understand makes them right with God? So we're still
mhm.
engaging with this idea of being right with God. It's not some other spiritual thing. It's being right with God. That's what's really in question here.
Mm.
Does
Gotcha.
that answer that question?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Um, I was curious how you handled that.
Yeah. And again, the reason why that third question doesn't say, if God asks you, why should I let you into my heaven? Is just because that was tweaked over 20 years ago at New Mexico
Hmm.
State to try and make it a little bit less of like a ticket to paradise
Mm.
starting point
Hmm.
salvation, but it's relational. It's about you and God. It's not about fire insurance. And the question itself could be rephrased to help decrease the likelihood that that's what they'll think this is all about.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. And then from here, then do you dive into the three questions?
Yeah, I do.
And let me ask this, what's the segue? How do you switch from diagnostics to this, or does it need a segue?
This is where probably um, experience helps. You know, I've gotten a little bit more experienced at being able to take something that they've previously said in the last 3 to 5 minutes
Hmm.
and reference it and then ask this question. So it at least seems like a legit segue, even if it's not.
Hmm.
But what I will tell the person I'm training, just ask the question. Just say, okay, well, let me ask you this. That's all the segue you need during this
Hmm.
whole presentation. Okay, now let me ask you this.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
there you would say the big first question. It's not a diagnostic, but the first question where you're actually going to engage with them and show them scripture to maybe challenge the way they think is, what do you live for? And you can
Hmm.
rephrase it as, what matters most to you? What's your drive in life? If they're not understanding what that means. And then again, just listen. The wonderful thing about this presentation, well, first I'll ask my guy, hey, what do you think they will say as an answer to this question? So I'll ask you, James, what do you think people largely, or what are some of the answers people would say for what do you live for?
Uh, my family, for having a good life, maybe for success, something along those lines.
Yeah, all of those are, families probably the most common that I've run into. Um, but yeah, success. Some people will say they're wanting to say something noble,
Mm.
so they'll say, I live to try and help other people and things like that. And so again, because it's all over the map, I'm not here to correct them. I'll say, wow, that's great, or I'll make a comment like, man, family is really important, or that's great that you want to help other people. I'm not here trying to make them question their answer
Hmm.
yet. I don't want them to question their answer based off of my response. Beautiful thing about this presentation is that I never have to be the bad guy for the most part.
Mm.
I carry a pocket Bible with me, a pocket New Testament with key verses from this presentation underlined all throughout it, so they're easy to show. And I'll just say, wow, that's great. And then I'll say, is it all right if I have you read a Bible verse that I think kind of speaks to this? Sure. Everyone always says sure. And for all I know, they've never held a Bible in their hands before and actually read it for themselves.
Hmm.
So that's good. I feel good
Hmm.
about, even if we have to leave right then. I'm like, man, they've just interacted with God's word for the first time. And
Yeah.
Isaiah 55 says his word will not come back void. It'll accomplish
Yeah.
the thing it was intended to accomplish. But I'll have them read 2 Corinthians 5:15, which says he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. And I will ask them, what is that verse saying? So it's essentially inductive Bible study.
Hmm. Cold turkey inductive Bible study.
Yeah, exactly. Cold turkey inductive Bible study um, for the unconverted. And I'll say, what is that verse saying? I used to say, well, even this presentation lists, what does that say to you? And after a while, I started to modify it and just say, what is it saying? Because I don't necessarily want them operating with the assumption that it can mean whatever it means to me,
Mm. Hmm.
different from what it
Yeah.
means to someone else. Like that it's about the reader rather than the
Hmm.
writer.
Hmm.
And just that nuance of the question helps me feel a little bit more comfortable asking it. What is it saying?
Hmm.
And sometimes they get it. They'll say, wow, well, this says you're supposed to, like, he died for all. And usually I'll say, who's he in this verse? And they'll usually say Jesus. They
Mm-hmm.
have enough of a background to guess that if somebody's dying for everyone, that's probably Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I'll say, regardless of what they say after that, sometimes they'll just kind of project their own belief system or what seems sensible onto the verse. They'll say, like, well, this just says that you gotta do your best and treat people right. And my my gut reaction is to say, what? Where are you getting that? It doesn't say that at all.
Yeah.
Did you even read it?
Yeah.
But I'll train my guy and say, we're not going to do that. Instead, we have a question that will help them hermeneutically interact with the verse better. And I'll just say, can you see how this verse is putting living for yourself and living for God at odds with each other? Usually I do the hand motions because
Mm.
I'm a
Mm-hmm.
demonstrative speaker, probably. At odds with each other. And they always say, oh, yeah, whether they got it initially or not.
Mm-hmm.
I'm helping them get it.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I can say is, uh, does that, like, here's a good one. Does that fit into your idea of what life is all about? And you can also ask a scale, kind of to have something to follow up with. If you were to put your life on a continuum 1 to 10, one's living for yourself and 10's living for God, where would you put yourself? And this again just gets them thinking about their own actual life. You want it to be personal,
Mm-hmm.
esoteric, and philosophical. And, what would you imagine most people say to that continuum question?
I would say they'll put it about 3 to 4.
My experience is that an uncanny percentage of people put themselves between 4 and 6.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's just because people figure middle of the road is the safest bet. I don't want to present myself as being too amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I'm not that amazing, but I also don't want to present myself as being too bad because that's bad. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe middle of the road is the safest bet.
Yeah.
I don't know that they're usually giving themselves a super honest assessment.
Yeah. I used to ask a question that I heard from someone that, which was, if you died today on a scale of 1 to 10, what are the chances are you get into heaven? And almost everyone said 7. Like that was 7 was the number. So, all
It's
right.
funny. Yeah. And when you do it enough too, like these kinds of questions and in this presentation, you begin to see the trends, which
Mm-hmm.
helps you know how to respond. And after years of doing this weekly, um, I began to see more and more and more trends, and I continue to see more and more trends. Even as I live in different places, I can find the common denominators between different campuses, and that's helping me to
Mm.
know how to respond. And that's maybe why I've tweaked and nuanced some of the ways that I ask the questions or which questions I really harp on.
Oh, man. Yeah. Yeah. And then what about the extra verses to,
Yeah. I have my guys, first off, I'm going to charge them with memorizing the 3 big verses that go with each of the 3 questions.
mm-hmm.
I want them to do that. And then if they do that, then I'm going to start giving them these other verses to have because it's just really helpful. Even though you're showing them the Bible, you want to know what they're reading. You want to be familiar with it
Yeah.
and be prepared to share it when you don't have a little pocket Bible on you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, these other verses can just help for kind of responding to something that they say. If you're kind of at a loss for what to say, you can say, well, one verse that I really like helps me think about it is Philippians 3:7 and 8. Whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. So I like that verse because it shows that living for, or actually, I really like John 10:10. I forgot.
Uh-huh.
The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And I'll say, I really like that verse because I think it shows that God's idea is for us to have really full life. So when he's asking us to live for him, it's not because he wants us to have this, enslaved life or this obligatory life. He's actually presenting full life if we'll live for him. And
Mm.
that just gives me a lot of peace and comfort knowing that, to maybe kind of take the edge off of them feeling like, are you telling me I'm selfish? at the end of the day, I'm like, yeah, I'm not telling you you're selfish. The Bible is,
Bible
but
is. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then I'll move on to the second question. And we can go through the whole presentation this way, but if you have any overarching questions,
I think at least let's at least hit the questions, and then any of your key things that you either nuance a little bit or kind of where you go. Um, I think those are the things I'd like to hit.
again, with question two, this is one of the ones where I typically just throw out the segue and say, well, here's another question for you, because it can be hard to go from where you were to
Mm-hmm.
this question. But you've set yourself up to be able, you said, can we ask you some questions? So
Questions. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want my, just a caveat here, I don't want the guy I'm training to come with the paper and be looking
Uh-huh.
off of it while we're talking to the person,
Yeah.
because that's kind of,
Yeah.
it
They've got to
seems kind of
memorize.
disingenuous.
Yeah. They've got to memorize. Essentially, they memorize the approach first. Then do they memorize the
Yeah.
question second, along with the verses?
The way that I hand it off, usually, like, so second outing, usually I'll ask them, all right, are you ready? I would like you to do the approach today. And that's it. Because there's probably plenty of feedback that they're going to need based on how they do the approach. So I want them to do all the approaches for that day. And then the next week, usually I'll give them the approach and the diagnostic questions.
Mm-hmm.
And then, if all things being equal, the next week, I'll tell them in advance the week before. Next week, I'm going to want you to do the first question. You've seen it now 2 or 3 times. I
Mm-hmm.
want you to go through the whole first question from the beginning all the way through the first question, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how they're memorizing it as well, is week by week.
Okay. Gotcha. Gotcha. And so the second question, what causes all the world's problems? What are the nuances or what are the things that you train them to deal with here? Or is there any way you like to word that pretty differently? I mean, I feel like that's a great question that is also you can ask that at any point in time of anybody you meet. It's a
It's
good,
and you can see that with both questions one and two, that in normal conversation we have with people, you could ask, it can become very organic to ask this question. The international trade is complaining. If you've noticed, in the people really bond through complaining
mm,
in the way the world operates. And so you find yourself, if you're at the barbershop or at the hardware store or at the park or at the pool or wherever at work, you notice that the way that people seem to connect with each other is by complaining together.
mm-hmm,
You always are finding people complaining about things not being right. And that can just make
mm-hmm,
it so easy to ask this question after you've engaged with them a little bit, to ask, like, man, it just seems like wherever you go, these kinds of problems exist. What do you think causes all these problems?
mm-hmm,
Um, and one nuance that I've started doing lately is including in this question, what do you think what causes all the problems that people in the world have? Just because I'm more asking about humanity's problems within humanity than I am asking about natural disasters and
mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing. It usually doesn't trip them up, but maybe it can just help if I talk about, like, humanity's problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I can see that. It at least points the discussion a little more clearly where you want it to go.
Right. Because this question two, I'll tell my guy too, we're going to camp out here. It's probably going to feel like we spend most of our time here, because I don't want to get on to the solution before establishing the problem. There's no good news if there's no bad news.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of time in our evangelism preparations, we get to the good news before the person has a full appreciation of the bad news.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Jesus said that only the sick need a physician. Those who are healthy need no physician. And I'm really trying to see if we can get to the point in this conversation through question two, where the person recognizes that they're sick,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that they need a physician. Otherwise, the good news about a physician is only kind of good. You're like, oh, okay, well, I guess
Yeah.
that's good for people who are sick.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
But if you know
That's
you
why,
have cancer, a
yeah,
physician's really great.
yeah. And I'll usually break up this question into like 2.1 and 2.2 or 2A and 2B, because the first thing that I'm trying to establish through this question and through Romans 3:10 through 12 and verse 23 is like the the problem of sin personally, or the presence of sin personally, like that we do wrong.
Mm,
And then I don't want to move on to the next question before I also have talked about the penalty for sin.
mm,
Because I think people will be happy to acknowledge, like, yeah, we're no one's perfect. We're all sinners. We all do wrong. And that's just how it is. So we have to accept it, and just try to be better. But what I really want to establish with 2B is no, and the wages of sin is death. Yeah, everybody sins, but that's not just hunky dory, like just something that we live with and are okay with. There's a
mm-hmm,
totally undesirable consequence
mm-hmm,
for sin. And if we've established that everyone sins, and including you, and we've established that the penalty for sin is death and separation from God forever, then what does that mean for you? And now that they've answered this question and they've gotten it, like that means that I deserve death, whether they say it in those words or not. Now I
mm-hmm.
can move on to the third question, which says, do you think there's a solution that works for everyone to solve this problem? Because I feel like it's going to land, or it's going to feel more like we want to talk about the solution at that point.
Mm-hmm.
The downside to camping out on question 2 is that sometimes they have to leave suddenly, and
Mm.
you've been camped out in the bad news for the whole time. You to get to the good news. And
Mm-hmm.
I just try to have like one verse in mind that I can leave them with if they have to leave, either to show them as they leave, or to just give reference as they leave and ask them, please look it up. That would give the whole gospel. And there's a number of verses that can do that. That's kind of like giving a tract.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. What do people typically respond to when you ask them that? Is there one solution that works for everyone?
Amazingly, the most common answer is greed. Oh, sorry, I'm answering question 2. Yeah, no. So question 2, the number one answer is greed. Greed is what causes all the world's problems. Number 3, very rarely does anyone say yes. Even legitimate Christians don't say yes.
Yes.
And you
Mm,
peel back the layers and become pretty convinced they have trusted in Christ. It's just like, no, it can't be one that works for everyone. People are too diverse. The world is too diverse. Everybody's in a different situation. There can't be just one. So like 99% of people say no. No, there can't be.
mhm.
And again, at this point, I I just skip down to the third bullet. I don't spend a lot of time trying to convince them that there can be one solution, and talk about and try to tackle like pluralism or anything like that.
Yeah.
Instead, I'll just ask them, if there was one solution that really worked for everyone, would you want to know? And in this
Mhm.
case, everybody says yes. I think I had one person
Yeah.
one time who said no, and he was really thinking about it. And it was kind of like it was like he was answering a riddle and he thought it was a trick question. And so he's like, I'm going to say no. And I was able to talk him through, like, well, what?
Oh.
This isn't a trick question. Would you? Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. Everybody says yes. They would want to know. How could they
Yeah.
not want to know the solution that works for everybody? And that just leads right into John 14:6. I'm the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. With all of these verses, like the ones in question 2, the ones in question 3, I'm doing the same thing as question 1.
Mhm.
What is that verse saying?
Say. Mm-hmm. What does that verse mean? Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
helping them if they're totally off. I'm helping them without telling them they're wrong. If I can help it, I don't want to tell them, like, I don't want to shame them
Mm.
by making
Mm-hmm.
them feel like they didn't get it right. Because I also don't want them to be reticent to try and read the Bible for its meaning moving
Mm.
forward.
Mm-hmm.
I want to keep them encouraged to read the Bible for what it means,
Yeah.
if at all possible.
Yeah. And let the Bible do its power and speak. And
Yeah.
then you lead them to a response.
Yeah. And if there's any uh, tendency towards monologuing at all, it's probably here at the end of question 3 for me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really want to make sure that and I've kind of learned how to make it question based still, so that
Mm-hmm.
it's not me going on a monologue for several minutes. It's me asking them questions and then kind of saying, yeah, because da, 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 da. And at this point, I don't think it's planned, but I tend to get more animated
Mm.
because I think I'm feeling the urgency. It feels like they're feeling the urgency, and it feels like we are approaching a culmination
Mm.
conversation. And so I feel like I can speak with a little bit more passion. And it's good to show your passion for the
Mm-hmm.
gospel. It
Mm-hmm.
really is good.
Yeah.
Uh, but then also a common uh, deficit in evangelism and in some presentations is the lack of training for how to actually invite somebody to make a decision right then and there.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How
We,
do you like to do that? Or what nuances would you put on that?
yeah. Well, these questions right here are great. Do you think you understand what you would need to do to be right with God after we've kind of talked about it? And I
Mm-hmm.
used to say, have you ever done this before? Once we established that, like Romans 10:9, if you could
Mm-hmm.
confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. Have you ever done that before? And I stopped asking that question because I think people felt like they were supposed to say yes, whether or not they actually could pinpoint a time when they did.
Mm.
Because it seems like if I say no, then there's like something wrong spiritually,
Mm.
or like I'm in this category now and I don't want to be in that category. So they'd say yes, and I'd ask them, well, tell me about that. And they'd say, well, my grandma was in this car accident about 3 years ago. And yeah, but she lived. And that really just, I think that was a time that was really meaningful to me.
Yeah.
They're not really putting it together.
Uh-huh.
They haven't
No.
actually come to a moment of repentance of sins and faith in Jesus Christ, but they feel like they're supposed to say yes. So I go ahead and just assume they haven't,
Mm-hmm.
frankly. And
Mm-hmm.
I ask them, you think you understand what it would take? And then can you think of any good reason why you wouldn't be willing to receive Christ into your life today? And I figure if they've done it and they know they've done it, they'll tell me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I can work with them on assurance of salvation. If you find
Mm-hmm.
out that somebody is a believer during this conversation, just think of it as an assurance of salvation conversation and walk
Mm-hmm.
back to the very beginning, the diagnostic question of God asks you, what makes you right with me? What would you say? If they said anything other than, well, it's nothing I've done, God, but
Mm-hmm.
through Jesus, you made it possible for me to be right with you by trusting in him. If they said anything other than that, then you have good grounds for just encouraging them and saying, hey, well, I would just remind you of this. You answered this. Now that we've talked about what it really takes to be right with God, would you answer that question any differently? And it can feel like the conversation was still worth it, even though you found
Mm.
out, oh, you're a Christian? No.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. And then from there, try to get their contact info and
If the person agrees, like they say, I can't think of any good reason to trust Christ, I say, you want to do that right now? You can do it right now. God's been listening to everything we've been saying the whole time, and he will listen to you if you just speak to him now and admit that you're a sinner who needs forgiveness and that you trust that Christ died for your sins and rose again so that that could be possible. If you do that now, you can receive him. And then I'll usually kind of gauge, do they seem like they don't know how to do that? Most people don't know how to pray, and they're very intimidated to pray, even
mm,
in their head.
yeah.
So I don't want to lead with this because I don't, if they will pray on their own, that's even better.
Mm-hmm.
But gauging on if they're kind of hesitant, I'll say, if it would be easier for you, I can voice a prayer and you can repeat after me, praying it to God, as long as you really mean it.
Mm-hmm.
And more than half of people opt for the
Yeah.
repeat after
Yeah.
version. And then afterwards, I'll ask them, these follow-up questions that are listed here, right? Did you mean what you just prayed? Where is Jesus right now? Kind of helping them to see that like he's
Change
within
has
their
happened.
heart. I mean,
Hmm.
this where was Jesus 30 minutes ago can again help them see that a change has happened. Well, he wasn't in my heart. He was hovering, or he was,
Hmm.
yeah. And then, yeah, with the follow-up, you're trying to set up another meeting as quick as possible because now Satan's whole game plan for this person is not to keep them from hearing the gospel. If they're now become a child of God, it's to get them to believe that was to invalidate it
Hmm.
somehow. And he'll start lying to them within the first 24 hours. It can't be
Hmm.
that easy. You've done too much bad. Those guys were crackpots, or that couldn't have, it can't really have happened today. And so you want to, as soon as they will meet up with you again, try and meet up with them and ask for their phone number. That's another thing. People don't like to ask for phone numbers.
Hmm.
It's kind of a conversation. Most people are willing to give their phone number.
Yeah.
So I would say, just ask for it. Hey, can we swap numbers? I want to be a help to you now. And that's even true if they say no, they're not ready to trust Christ, and you make a plea and say it's urgent. I hope that you will really consider it. And do you have a Bible? Offer them a Bible or a way to get, that can be another reason to meet up with them. Well, I have a Bible that I could get to you. Is it cool if I bring it by later tonight or tomorrow or where you're going to be? That can be a good pretext for following up with somebody, whether they trusted Christ or not.
Hmm.
And then, yeah, just try to meet with them and talk about assurance of salvation.
Yeah.
To Yeah.
Yeah. And then yeah, what kind of follow-up, or how long will you try to follow up? Someone gives you their phone number. What's that look like? Especially as you're adding people weekly, to your Rolodex, for those people old enough to know what that term
Yeah,
means.
and well, I'm not sure your audio cut out a little bit there.
Oh, I was saying, how long do you follow up with them, or like what kind of level of tenacity do you give to that? How long do you follow up with them if you're not getting responses?
Yeah. And here's where, again, I probably could be more tenacious in
Hmm.
following up with them. I usually text them once or twice. If they text me back, that eggs me on.
Yeah, yeah,
If they don't text me back at all, I might text them one at a time, like a while later, and just tell them, "Hey, I was thinking about you,"
sure.
and try to give them a Bible verse that would
Hmm.
encourage them without
Hmm.
necessarily trying to ask them for something,
Mm.
like to meet up with me,
Hmm.
just because I want them to think favorably towards me and be warm towards maybe meeting up with me, because I don't just represent expectation
Mm.
to them.
Yeah,
But like I said, there's not a great follow-up rate of conversion
yeah.
on these kinds of evangelism outings. And so it's not a great strategy for reaching the campus or making disciples.
Hmm.
But when that person you've trained now has the boldness and the wherewithal and the ability to share the gospel with people that they already know,
Hmm.
that they see regularly, now
Yeah,
follow up becomes really
yeah.
possible in
Really high.
discipleship.
Yeah.
And I've seen God, like, all the time this happens. This semester, there's a guy who wanted to go with me to do some evangelism while I was taking my guy I was training, and this guy said, "There's two other guys that want to come with us." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, we have to figure out a way to we'll pair up differently, and I'll let this one guy come with me." And he was like, "I've never done this before. Um, I've never done this before." And he's like, he's in Bible college, right? He's
Hmm.
he's he's 25. Like, so often we assume that people have shared the gospel and they haven't.
Yeah.
I told him, I let him off the hook. I can just kind of do the presentation and you can observe or you can jump in. He's like, "I think I'll observe."
Hmm.
And that day we led someone to Christ,
Uh-huh.
right? The very first person we talked to. And the guy who came with me, his mind was blown. He was like, is that pretty normal? I said, well, no, it's not like normal that we lead the first person we talk to Christ, but people do come to faith.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And he was just jazzed, and he's come to more evangelism outings since then. And it just so happens that guy we led to faith has actually been a success story on follow up,
Hmm.
because we did it so in partnership with the campus ministry
Hmm.
on that campus. And he started coming to their lunch Bible study, and I've been able to meet with him again. And like he's actually taking steps
Mm.
in walking with Christ, which is really cool. And I'm getting to
Yeah.
celebrate with this young man that I took out one time to share with me. He's not been out another time with me. He's gone with other people and been paired up with other people. But I just believe God does that, the timing of
Hmm.
it, so often to encourage us. And that happened for me when a super senior was training me as a freshman. The first person we ever went up to approach ended up being a high school classmate of mine. So I had to not be just a mute observer, which kind of
Uh-huh.
pushed me forward.
Yeah.
And then the second person we ever talked to, I had already been shared the last time. So I thought, well, I'll go ahead and lead on this one too. And I got to lead a guy to Christ. The second week I'd ever gone out and done that kind of
Mm.
gospel share.
Hmm.
And I was thinking, man, God did that so that I would be totally ready to go share the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So just to ask that, so you got trained in this by a super senior at New Mexico State who'd been trained by,
Isaac Simmons.
okay, well, you can express our gratitude to him that he trained you and that you get to share with us here today.
I'm
Um,
grateful to him too.
I
Yeah.
really appreciate this. Um, just to share a cool story with you, not that I expect this from everybody, and I'm not great on following up as well, but um, our friend Jake at New Mexico Highlands, he met the campus minister sometime, and for 3 years, Jonathan texted him once a week, basically just inviting him to Christian Challenge. Got zero response for 3 years. He kept texting him, and then finally a crisis had happened.
Mm,
I don't remember the whole story, and he was like, "Yeah," and so I uh, I encourage tenacity. Um, there's and I'm impressed with Jonathan's tenacity and in
yeah.
continuing that follow up. Um, so I think we
Bullish
can, yeah,
tenacity, let's say.
yeah, almost, yeah, and um, I think sometimes it's like, if you lost them, you lost them. Like another text message, they're either gonna keep listening and getting them and deleting them, or they're gonna block your number. Either way, it doesn't matter. And I'm sure Jonathan was sending out some form of a bulk copy paste text, most weeks, but that tenacity pays off. Anything else you'd tell us? I really appreciate you running through this. Anything else you'd tell us about how you go about training a guy when you're training him?
Something very important that's after the conversation
Mm.
um, is debriefing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's real, like that's where the real learning I think happens oftentimes,
Mm-hmm.
is in debriefing the conversation. And that's probably where they're most tender to be teachable
Mm.
at any other time, is after you've done some evangelism and asking them, what did you observe? And what do you think went well? And what stood out to you? And what were you challenged by? And, and even if they're doing part of the presentation, being willing to say, how did you think that went for you when you were doing this? And being able to say something like, well, I don't mean to be a stickler, but
Yeah.
if you'll do this instead of this, I think it might help. And I go ahead and tell them, like, you don't have, the goal isn't to be stuck in this rigid presentation for the rest of your life. But
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell them, whenever I was in elementary school basketball, if I dribbled around my back during a dribbling drill, I would get in trouble,
Mm.
because we're supposed to be working on dribbling with our left hand and dribbling with our right hand and maintaining control. If I dribbled between my legs, it was like, what are you doing, Englehart? Getting fancy. But nobody gets mad at LeBron James for dribbling between his legs or around his back. It's because he's put in the work of getting the fundamentals down.
Hmm.
So now he can work in creativity and agility and responsiveness. And so I kind of set that up as again, it sounds like I'm being a stickler, but it's just because I want you to be really good at this so that you can launch, it can be a launch pad
Hmm.
for you. If you don't get really good at it, you won't have something to train your guy in
Hmm.
later because
Hmm.
it'll be this fluid thing of just intuitive sharing the gospel. And it's harder to train somebody in your own intuition than it is to train them in a presentation. So get
Hmm.
really good at this. I'm going to hold you to it if that's okay with you. And then we'll get better and better at being agile.
Hmm. Yeah. What would you say to somebody who's like, man, that seems like a lot of work and maybe even a complicated presentation to take a year to train somebody in? Why don't we just train them in the bridge method, for example, and we can train them in
Yeah.
a day.
Well, I will say this: this presentation, it doesn't work to just give it to somebody or like share it with them. I don't expect anybody listening to this podcast to be able to go out and do the 3 questions tomorrow, even if you listen to it like 8 times. So it really does require the time of repetitive demonstration.
Hmm.
And that might make you think like, it's not worth it. I can teach somebody a different presentation quicker. And that may be true. I'm not saying this is the only presentation that works.
Hmm.
For me, the reason I like it is again because it's question based and because it's uh, Bible verse based.
Hmm.
I feel like I can use it anywhere,
Hmm.
and and it makes me feel the least awkward,
Yeah.
which is one less barrier.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. And
so
there's just,
it's cool. The week after,
go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to say I can't remember if it was the day that you and I went to go do the 3 questions presentation here in Fort Worth, or the week after. I had told you that oftentimes I can use this in conversations that just come up.
Hmm.
And a freshman on our campus, our Bible college campus, presumably who's a believer, who had to demonstrate that to get admitted, came in and started talking to me about our upcoming staff versus students softball game. And one thing led to another. And as he demonstrated that maybe he was not as secure in his salvation as I would have expected, I was able to pick up with these questions. And I was asking questions from this presentation, and it led all the way to him realizing that he needed to repent and trust Christ and doing so.
Hmm.
And I've seen that happen. Like, it gives me tools to talk to somebody on an airplane who's sitting next to me, to talk to somebody at a park, or to talk to a relative or a friend. Like, I just really like the question based and the fact that I got agile at it. But you can do that with a lot of presentations.
Hmm.
I like
That's the
this
one
one
you
better than.
like. Yeah. I think there's something to be said also just for needing to spend a year with somebody. If you take them out, let's say 2 semesters, 36, roughly 36 times that they go with you to share the gospel, like that's just really good training. And your chances of them doing that and going ahead and continuing with that are pretty high. And it's fairly universal. And I have, there's a lot of presentations I like. I like the Romans Road. I like the bridge. I like 3 questions. And they're all fairly easy to use, but no one took me out, and it's harder for me to see how I would like continually take somebody out. Um, and some of those can be used in different times, but some of them you need something to write on. Some of them a little harder to be conversational about. Um, so if you're listening to this, and I encourage you to read through it. You can get it all at New Mexico State. What's your website? I'll put it in the show notes, but so we have it verbally here.
Yeah, that's nmsuchristianchallenge.org.
nmsuchristianchallenge.org. Excellent. I would
Under the
encourage,
resources tab.
yeah, under resources.
And
Excellent.
it's referred to as Campus E,
Okay.
meaning campus evangelism. That's what everybody calls it at New Mexico State,
Okay.
Campus E.
Yeah. Excellent. And one more question. What if you're someone listening and you're not near a college campus? Where would you try to find people who like you could go door to door, but then you're kind of I don't know if there's anything wrong with that, but you're interrupting something. I'm not usually too happy when someone comes to my door. Where would you go about finding somebody a good place to practice and approach and train people.
Yeah. And it really does. I think that where you are in your setting has some bearing on what presentation you want to use.
Mm,
But there's a New Mexico State grad who's an engineer down in Houston. I know who goes, I think, every Sunday afternoon to the parks in Houston.
mm,
And, most of his conversations end up being with, it seems like, based on the stories he's writing up, because New Mexico State students and alums are encouraged to write up a paragraph summary of any time they share the gospel with people and send it in so they can be dispersed to everybody and everybody can be praying and be
mm,
encouraged. I highly
mm,
recommend um, sharing about when you share and
mm,
encouraging others to share with you because it just keeps you going. But
mm,
it seems like this guy mostly gets to talk to a lot of homeless people, which is a whole
mm,
different ball game.
mm,
Anyways, you want to know who you're dealing with and what the trends are there. But he's using this presentation at parks. I've done it during Project Impact summers in shopping districts
mm,
of cities. We've done it in parks. Um, it may be that you want to do a different presentation if you're not on a college campus. The hard thing about someplace that's not a college campus or malls, you can do it in malls too,
mm,
um, is maybe you're not necessarily finding people who are not doing something.
mm,
They're on the go, and you might have to kind of stop them. Or like you said, in their home, they were. It's kind of an intrusion on the rhythm of what they were doing, and they're standing there at the door. So maybe consider some creative ways to adjust it. But at the end of the day, just go for repetition. I've always said that I think Nike stole evangelism's slogan. Just do it.
Just do it. Yeah. Yeah.
And then you'll learn and you'll be able to help other people.
Yeah. Yeah. Matt told me once, he said the best evangelism presentation is whichever one you'll use. And
Yeah.
so, but yeah, parks seem like a good place, food court, shopping mall. Find that husband who's sitting around tired of shopping and,
In the I don't care chair.
yeah. Yeah. In the I don't care chair. That's exactly right. Um, well, awesome. I appreciate you, Micah. I hope that your sharing and training there continues to go well at Texas Baptist College, and look forward to running into you again sometime soon.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, James. Praying that, that everybody who listens will just be somewhat more encouraged to get out there and be a witness.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, listeners. We'll catch you next time on the OneLink podcast.